like to thank everyone on behalf of the Edmund and Mary Freeman Committee, Memorial Committee. I'm Mike Chesson, a member of that committee, and I've been asked to introduce the program tonight. This is the 17th annual Edmund and Mary Freeman Memorial Lecture, honoring the memories of two very important people to the history of the university and to the city of Missoula. Edmund was a professor of English for many years at the university, and Mary, his wife, contributed greatly to the arts in Missoula before she passed away. It's almost 2 decades since this lecture series has been established, and I think it would be difficult to find someone who better exemplifies the qualities that my colleague Edmund Freeman, I know, admired during our long association together. Our speaker tonight is Bill Wasmuth, of the director of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. I think that I can't help but be reminded of something that Edmund used to say during our many discussions. He said we can all be more courageous than we are. He lived by that principle, and I must say in always a very civilized way. Perhaps that principle still applies, but in recent years we've seen a great deal of turbulence, economically, politically, both here and abroad. And so perhaps the gap between courageous action and intolerant or even violent response has narrowed since Edmund made that statement. I know that Bill Wasmuth has himself been subjected to such responses as a result of what he has done in recent years. And I was saddened to hear that his colleague in North Idaho, Sheriff Broadbent, is no longer employed, and perhaps indirectly he lost his job because of his conscientious devotion to doing something about extremists in the Pacific Northwest. I could very easily make a long statement about Bill Wasmuth, but I'm going to turn to Reverend Bob Varker of the Campus Methodist Ministry, who very early after his arrival here formed a human rights group in Missoula, and he's been active in a statewide and regional statewide and regional human rights coalitions since he came to the university. He is an associate and friend of Bill Wasmuth, and I would like you to give him the warm welcome that he deserves for what he has been doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. I don't need to go into a lot of detail about Bill and his personal life because that is in your program. Let me instead say that some of the characteristics of intolerance are the attempt to stifle free and open dialogue, to intimidate those who speak with reason and for reason, and to frighten away those who expose hatred for its own inherent sickness. In September of 1986, Order 2, which was the successor of Order 1, which was the violent arm of Pacific Northwest racism, attempted to stifle and intimidate and frighten and ultimately kill tonight's speaker. He refused to be intimidated or silenced then, and he does not bow to such action now. In the spring of 1987, a white student union was formed on this campus. And in direct response to that, in the fall of 1987, then President Cook asked for this campus to respond. Following Dr. Cook's lead, the Wesley Foundation helped organize a seminar on racism, and Bill Wasmuth played no small part in helping us pull that all together. So Bill is not a stranger to Missoula crowds and audiences, for he came here in '89 and participated in our seminar. Dr. Cook also was host for a fundraiser for the Northwest Coalition, and Bill was here again. And then in July of 1990, Bill was here also for the quarterly meeting of the Northwest Coalition, where other Missoula people had an opportunity to hear him. He speaks with reason and understanding. He also speaks from an informed insight. And so we are pleased, Bill, to have you here tonight. Please welcome Bill Wasmuth.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thanks to all of you. Those of you that know Bud Barker know that I was justified in being a little concerned that he might introduce me with his guitar and a song. I was a little anxious about that, but thank you very much, Bob. It's been a pleasure working with you before, and it continues to be such. Bob served on our board of directors for the coalition for several years, from the beginning of the coalition, actually, until about a year and a half, 2 years ago. I want to say thanks to the Freeman Memorial Lecture Committee for inviting me. I consider it to be a real honor to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight. Thanks also to Edmund and Mary Freeman, in whose memory this series of 17 years has been continued. They were evidently people committed to dialogue in this community, to the humanities, and to making this community an enriching place to live. And we owe them a debt of gratitude. It's great to be back in Missoula. Even though I now live in Seattle, my background in Idaho ties me very much with these Rocky Mountain areas. And I'll be back in Montana in 2 weeks to work with local groups in 7 different cities and towns throughout the state, from Billings to Kalispell to Bozeman to Thompson Falls. And I've traveled throughout Montana several different times in past decades, and always find that a very rewarding experience. The scenery itself is enriching. The goodness and hospitality of Montana people is sometimes overwhelmingly nice to experience. I know rural. I grew up in Green Creek in Idaho, total population 32, no zeros, just 32. It's on the Nez Perce Reservation, one of the most homogeneous environments that you could possibly imagine. My grandparents' surnames are Wasmuth, if you say that the way it was originally meant, Bemhoff, Heinen, Schmidt, all German, obviously. We were all Catholic. We could tell if a non-Catholic was coming into town. A certain aura just followed them in over the hill as they came down the road. If they stayed very long, we converted them. If they didn't convert, they didn't stay very long. It was a very simple process. Obviously all Caucasian. We were all also cousins, related to each other. In a very provincial kind of environment in those days. I'm old enough that we didn't do a lot of traveling, and we didn't have TV even in those days. And so since we were related to each other, I, like many others, ended up going to the seminary and becoming a Catholic priest, because there was no one to marry anyways, so we might as well. I was ordained in 1967. Being the swift learner that I am, it only took me 21 years to figure out that maybe there was somebody out there that I could marry. And I determined in 1986 that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life as a single person, and indeed never intended that, and resigned my parish in Coeur d'Alene in 1988, was married in 1989. Now, some would call this midlife crisis. If it is such, and if you haven't gone through yours yet, look forward to it. It's a fine experience. I enjoyed the 21 years I spent working as a priest in Idaho. The transition wasn't nearly as traumatic as people suggested it was going to be. And I'm a partners now with a wonderful person, and that's going all very well, and I like what I'm doing for the coalition. So if your midlife crisis is as good as mine, look forward to it if you haven't had it already. I say something about my background to let you know a little bit more of who I am, but also to say that I have all the prejudices and all the misinformation of someone who comes from that period of time and from that kind of monoculture environment. None of us is without prejudice. None of us is untouched by the racism that surrounds us all. So I'd suggest this evening that the challenge before each one of us is to simply acknowledge our prejudices and our bigotries, to break past that denial stage, and then work individually and together to make this world a better place for all the citizens of this planet to live. I think that's the challenge for us, to get past that denial, to acknowledge simply that we are a part of a racist society, that we are still part of a society that contains bigotry and prejudices, to acknowledge that in ourselves, in our community, and then be able to move on to fix it. I now work for the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. That's a coalition of 260 organizations in the 5 states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. We came together in 1987 to address the issue of bigotry in the Northwest. We do local community organizing. We provide resources and networking to local communities. We do community awareness raising and education. We do monitoring of incidents and of supremacist groups. Basically, we challenge the people of the Northwest to recommit themselves to living in harmony with justice for all citizens. I have on the table behind me here some materials if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the coalition and even becoming a part of it. The stuff on this side of the table is freebies. You can help yourself to that if you want. The stuff on this side of the table are kind of reference works to look at if you'd like to go into this subject a little bit more. So I'm honored to be here tonight to share some thoughts with you. And my thoughts are going to be more in the form of something to challenge your own thinking and hopefully your discussion with others in the days to come. I'm not going to propose perfect solutions or nice pat answers to things because I don't think they exist. But I hope as you leave here this evening that you've been challenged to think about some things. Maybe you won't agree with everything that I have to say, that's fine. But I hope that you are thinking about the issues at any rate. And I want to start by suggesting that there is some real turmoil going on in the soul of America today. And that's probably not news to you. Turmoil in a lot of different forms. Environmental concerns. Will there be an ozone layer in the future? Do we even need one? What are we going to do with all our garbage? In Seattle, we ship our garbage by train down to a dump site in Oregon. Send it to the neighbors, seems to be the theory. The demand for minerals and wood products that seems to be overtaking whole areas with nothing left untouched. The jobs versus preservation of nature, perceived to be such, whether or not that's a correct statement. On the plane this morning, I was sitting next to a geologist who was very much into that dilemma. It was a very alive issue for him. Economic concerns are a part of this turmoil as well. National debt, deficit spending, the cost of housing and the homelessness that leads to, the cost of education and providing a quality education on all levels. Or just the questions about where are we as a country, some of those questions raised before, during, and after the Persian Gulf War. But beyond that, a country where very few vote and only the rich are elected. What happened to democracy by and for the people? Or what is our vision of ourselves as a country, or do we even have one? Is one being proposed for us, held out for us? What does the presidential runs of people like David Duke or even Pat Buchanan say about our vision of ourselves as a nation? Or maybe about our lack of vision of who we are as a nation? I suggest that if we analyze all of the major campaigns to date, that we come up with some very serious challenges in terms of who we are as a nation and what we're about as a people. And into the midst of this turmoil, and you can add to that, I'm sure, many more elements of turmoil, into the midst of this turmoil, bigotry of all kinds raises its ugly head. supremacist activity, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but other kinds of bigotry and discrimination as well. A study of housing here in Montana several years ago that showed that way over 50% of those people of color who applied for housing were discriminated against. The problems that exist on the job and workforce training that is needed in so many situations for people to work next to others who are of different backgrounds from themselves. Or racism showing itself in law enforcement agencies as the constantly repeating videotape of the beating of Rodney King in LA dramatizes for us. The sexism that is exercised against the women of our society. Attacks on the gay and lesbian population in America, responsible for almost 80 deaths in 1988. This last year in 5 major cities, an increase of 30% of malicious harassment attacks on the gay lesbian population. Yes, I would suggest that we have some real turmoil going on around us, and that these are days that try our souls if we care about justice and if we care about equality. If we reflect on the current situation, rather than just follow the propaganda, if we're critical, rather than just accept that propaganda as often being presented as the truth, then I think we have troubled hearts, individually and maybe as a society. I think we recognize that as occupants of this planet, we simply have not learned some basic fundamental realities, how to get along with each other and how to get along with this earth itself. We've figured out very well how to destroy, but we've not done nearly as well in figuring out how to get along. So whether it erupts in an attack on a gay person here at the University of Montana, or whether it erupts in the refusal of someone to rent a home or an apartment to a Native American family in Great Falls, or whether it erupts in an assault on the streets of Portland by racist skinheads, or in a verbal attack on Jewish people in the name of Christian identity theology, or whether that turmoil erupts in the war in the Persian Gulf or in dumping waste oil downstream storm drains, they're all, I would suggest, eruptions of the same problem. We are not getting along with each other and with this earth on which we live. Yes, I think many of us have troubled hearts. These are days of turmoil in the soul of the United States today. Put it in a lighter vein, I'm reminded of a poster I saw a few years ago. It's one of those posters of the globe shown from the space shot from the moon, this big blue marble. And the words under it said, "Occupants of Earth, this is God. Please vacate in 3 days. I have prospects for better tenants." So in the midst of the challenges facing our country today, and I've only given a very superficial listing of them to set the stage for the rest of what I want to talk about, in the midst of all this appears bigotry. In the midst of the bigotry appears the supremacists. And yes, indeed, supremacy has always been a part of the fabric of our society, but it appears anew these days, especially in the Northwest. I'm going to briefly describe some of the supremacist groups in the Northwest, and if you want to go into understanding more about them, I would refer you to a couple of books. This one, Blood in the Face by James Ridgway, is a good explanation, description of the various supremacist groups in the United States these days and very current. If you want to have more of an analytical look, I would suggest James Aho's book called The Politics of Righteousness. He's a sociologist at Idaho State University. This book is based on 5 years of research with over 500 supremacists in the state of Idaho. Change the names, change the places, it applies in other places as well. I think Professor Aho has some very interesting analysis that comes from his research. I would highly recommend that. But let's begin with the Aryan nations, perhaps because that's one of the most well-known supremacist groups in this area. In fact, some would kind of lump everything under the Aryan nations. Church of Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations came from California to Hayden Lake, Idaho in 1970. In 1976, Richard Butler bought some property there and set up a compound, and indeed it is a compound with a barrier fence around it with a guard gate, etc. Some of you remember that old jingle that went, "This is the church, this is the steeple." When you do that about Butler's compound, you have to add one line. This is the church, this is the steeple, this is the gun tower. The steeple's on one end of the church, the gun tower's on the other end of the church. It is a compound. In 1979, Richard Butler began to implement his plan, his unique kind of plan for supremacy in the Northwest. He began to gather at weekend-long conferences each summer the leaders of the supremacist groups of the country, the Ku Klux Klan, the Christian Patriots, the Posse Comitatus, White Aryan Resistance, Covenant Sword, Arm of the Lord, Christian identity groups, etc., etc. And his message to them was very basic. He said to them, look, we all have the same goal. We all want a white America. But we're losing that battle for white America. Jewish people have taken over the government and the economy. The government is Zog, Zionist-occupied government. The mud races, their term for the people of color, he said, have invaded and polluted the population. And he suggested to those who would listen to him that only by overlooking their differences and by uniting with each other would their goal of a white America be at all achievable. And he also suggested that they had lost so much that they needed to start by only making the 5 northwestern states into their white Aryan homeland. His point, of course, was to establish that white Aryan homeland in the 5 northwestern states, that he would be the leader, that Haven Lake would be the capital. He advocated that this would be a bloody battle, but he also said it is God's command to each one of us. Richard Butler was successful in his rhetoric. He managed to get people who refused to sit with each other before to sit in dialogue about this possibility, to work together. The Klan and the neo-Nazis, for example, who hadn't had a dialogue relationship before. In 1983, Robert Matthews heard the message at that annual Congress, and shortly afterwards, he and a number of others met in Medellin Falls in eastern Washington to set up the order, Bergerschweigen Strike Force 1. And they began a crime spree that included the murder of Alan Berg, Jewish talk show host in Denver, included the murder of Robert West, one of their own, included robberies of over $6 million from banks and armed cars, included the bombing of a synagogue in Boise and other crimes as well. The point of the order was simply to cause enough terrorism, enough turmoil, so that the U.S. government, who they perceived to be weak in the early 80s anyway, would simply say, we can't cope with all of this that you're doing, and so simply take the 5 northwestern states as your white Aryan homeland, but get off our backs. That was the point. They were following the Turner Diaries, which is a novel written by a neo-Nazi on how to overthrow the U.S. government through terrorism. Robert Matthews, the leader of the order, was killed in a shootout with federal officials when he refused to leave a house that was burning and died a martyr's role for the Aryan movement. The rest of the order people were convicted in a trial in Seattle in December of 1985. In 1986, as Bob alluded to a little bit earlier, Order 2 was formed. That's the group that bombed my house in September of '86. They killed one of their own as well, and 2 weeks after they bombed my house, they set off more bombs in downtown Coeur d'Alene. They were captured as well and convicted. In 1990, 3 members of the Aryan Nations were stopped by the FBI several hours before they set off the first bomb in Seattle at a disco club there that was frequented by minorities. They also had plans to bomb some businesses owned by minorities in Tacoma. Their bombing set, they said, to achieve a high kill ratio. This coming weekend at the Aryan Nations compound in Hayden Lake, about 100 youth and adults will gather for the 4th annual Aryan Youth Congress that always convenes around Hitler's birthday. They will organize for the coming race war. The youth are being told to avoid notice, to stay out of trouble, to stay out of jail, to organize and prepare so that they can be leaders during the coming race war, which will happen, they say, when white America wakes up and realizes that all of its problems are attributable to people of color and to the Jewish population. The problem, of course, with that rhetoric is that there will not be a race war, and that sooner or later that young group of people will grow impatient and they'll start their own war. They'll set out on their own violence. They'll follow the pattern of Order 1, Order 2, and the group that went to Seattle. So I and others fully expect to see more violence, particularly from the young adherents of the Aryan Nation ideology in the next couple of years. Richard Butler isn't as much a leader of the supremacist movements in terms of the adults as he was in the early 80s, but his leadership and his growing interest in the young people is certainly a cause for concern. Richard Butler is a preacher of what's called Christian identity theology. In short, Christian identity theology is that theological foundation for supremacy throughout much of the United States. Identity teaches that the true Israelites are the Anglo-Saxons of Europe who are the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Jesus came as Savior of the true Israelites and promised to build his kingdom around them. The land for that kingdom is the United States of America. So identity theology teaches that God has commanded that the United States be a homeland for the white Christian nation. So when identity people like Richard Butler talk about taking back the white Aryan nation, they really mean taking back as commanded by God. That this is something that was intended for them in the first place, this is the way God arranged it, and they're simply doing what God wills. Christian identity teaches that Jewish people are literally the children of a mating between Eve and Satan. They are the children of the devil. The Jewish control of the U.S. government and of the UN is therefore the work of Satan. It teaches that there is only one pure seed line from Adam, the Anglo-Saxons, and that all other seed lines are subhuman, and that there should absolutely be no mixing of the races. And so while Richard Butler's version of this Christian identity theology is perhaps the most known and perhaps the most violent, it is by no means the only expression of this ideology. The National Christian Identity Directory for the country lists over 300 groups or organizations in the U.S. 4 of those are in Montana. Christian Defense League in Lolo, Church of Jesus Christ Christian in Thompson Falls, Lamplighter in Libby, and Yahshua's Covenant Mission in Knoxon. Some other Christian identity individuals have surfaced over recent years, several of them running for elected office. One in 1990 running for the Board of Trustees of the Ronan Pueblo School District, and another running for the Lake County Superintendent of Schools, both defeated very roundly after they were exposed for being believers in Christian identity. Christian patriotism is a kind of another umbrella name for some of these groups. Like Christian identity, Christian patriotism believes that America has a special place in the divine plan of salvation. It generally advocates the support of what it calls the organic Constitution, that is, the Constitution without all the amendments, that organic Constitution provided by God to give natural citizenship to white Christian males. All others, in their mind, are 14th Amendment citizens, namely they have citizenship that is granted by the amendments to the Constitution. Some of these Christian patriots would advocate the overthrow of those amendments, the elimination of those amendments, and in their minds get us back to the way things were meant to be by the God who established the U.S. Constitution in the first place. Like identity, Christian patriotism generally promotes that the current U.S. government has been taken over by the children of Satan, the Jewish people, Zog, Zionist-occupied government. Therefore, it is invalid. Therefore, you do not have to follow its laws. Therefore, you do not have to pay its taxes. This forms the basis for their tax protests and for their disregard for the legal system. Included under Christian patriotism in Montana are groups such as the Golden Mean Society here in Missoula, the Constitutionalists in Knoxon and Belgrade, the East Slope Taxpayers Association, and the Posse Comitatus in some rural areas. While often limiting their activities to publishing information and to tying up the court system with frivolous kinds of lawsuits, legal, lengthy lawsuits, they have also threatened, though, to defend their positions with weapons, to defend their perceived rights to disregard state and federal laws. And at least in one case, the case of Posse Comitatus leader Gordon Call, violence did happen in 1983. He killed 2 federal authorities that were enforcing the laws against him that he was violating, and then he himself was killed by federal authorities a few months later in Arkansas. Liberty Lobby, under the leadership of Willis Carto, is the national Christian patriot organization that provides a link between all of these various groups, especially through its newspaper called The Spotlight. That's a tabloid-sized 20-plus page newspaper that comes out weekly that has a subscription rate of 110,000 throughout the country. Openly anti-Semitic in its rhetoric, in its journalism, its racism is also there, sometimes just a little bit below the surface. Willis Carto and the Liberty Lobby provide the leadership for the formation of the National Institute of Historical Review, which provides the pseudo-intellectual basis for the racism of the United States, and particularly the supremacy of the Christian patriots. Willis Carto was also a leader in the formation of the Populist Party in 1984, which ran David Duke as its presidential candidate and Bo Gritz as its vice presidential candidate for part of that campaign. Bo Gritz is now the presidential candidate for the Populist Party. As you maybe noticed in the newspaper, he just recently was in Kalispell and drew some 600 people possibly there for a rally. Christian patriotism is very much alive in some of the rural parts of the Northwest as well as in other parts of the country. Another form of the racist movement is the skinheads. They have mostly been confined to urban areas since arrival of the movement in the United States a decade ago from Europe. The largest concentration in the Northwest is in Portland, with about 200 members of several different white supremacist skinhead groups. However, recently, racist skinheads have toned down their radical punk style of dress and haircuts, etc., in order to be less distinguishable. This change has also enabled them to move more freely into rural areas. There have been skinheads in Casper, Wyoming. There have been skinheads in Knoxon and in Superior, Montana. At times, there have been racist skinhead activities here around in the University of Missoula, not over any lengthy period of time, however. And there was that effort that Bob mentioned some time ago to set up the White Student Union here on campus to impact young people. Southern Justice skinheads from Vancouver, Washington have been recruiting farther west all the time. Most recently, their literature has shown up in Boise. Other supremacist skinhead material has shown up in Pendleton and some of the more rural areas inland from the coast in Oregon and Washington, too. The occasionally successful attempts by the adults in the supremacist movement to recruit the skinheads and other racist youth are very disturbing. The young racists will put into violent action the bigoted hatred of the adults that often is only rhetoric on their part. The Church of the Creator, another supremacist group, a vilely bigoted organization. A member was just arrested in Florida several months ago for the murder of a Persian Gulf War veteran, a black man who was killed simply because he was black by a Church of the Creator member. You've seen some, perhaps, Church of the Creator literature distributed here in Missoula recently as well. Looks like this, actually. It's called Racial Loyalty. The anti-Indian movement to complete the supremacist activity in this area. Under some very innocent-sounding names, the anti-Indian movement has been organizing since 1968. In Montana, it has appeared as CIRA, Citizens Equal Rights Alliance, PAR, Protect America's Rights and Resources. CIRA has its headquarters in Big Arm, Montana. ICERR, Interstate Congress for Equal Rights and Responsibilities, All Citizens Equal, ACE, with its headquarters in Polson. Various other property owners associations throughout the Northwest. Mostly active, these anti-Indian groups in Wisconsin, Montana, and Washington state, they've become home to a number of militantly bigoted activists. And certainly not everyone who is working for a solution to the conflicts resulting from the oppression of the Native American people and the violations of those treaties for 2 centuries is a racist or a supremacist. Some of them certainly are. Here in Montana, the anti-Indian movement is a major concern that needs to be seriously addressed when we're looking at supremacist kind of activity. So a very brief and a very quick snapshot of supremacist life and activity in the Northwest. Now on to the second part. What are they telling us about ourselves? And I think that's the more important part actually this evening. Certainly we are all very quick and very clear to disclaim any ties to supremacist groups. Certainly all of us here would abhor that level of bigotry. We see that level of bigotry as being destructive of its victims, being destructive of its perpetrators as well, and being destructive of society at large. And so for all of us, that sort of supremacy is something very abhorrent and very much rejected and very easily rejected by us. But I want to suggest tonight that we should not do that too quickly or too easily. I want to suggest tonight that what we hear from the supremacists is the exaggerated, out loud expression of what is churning quietly beneath the surface in the soul of our society. I want to suggest this evening that the supremacists are expressing clearly and loudly the racism that is spoken more quietly in mainstream society in more polite circles. Supremacy, if you want, is the tip of the iceberg. But what supports that visible destroyer of society is the far larger and much more destructive iceberg below the surface. Certainly, the murder of Mulugeta Surah by the racist skinheads in Portland in 1988 is different than slighting a person of color at a grocery store checkout stand in Missoula, or discriminating against a Native American family applying for an apartment in Great Falls. But the feelings and the attitudes behind all of those actions come from the same problem of prejudice and bigotry. It's all on the same scale, just a different place on that scale. And therefore, I want to suggest that we can uncover some of the suppressed attitudes and feelings of our society, that silent bigotry, if you want, which often drives our own actions and the decisions of our society. We can uncover some of that by paying attention to what the supremacists are telling us about ourselves. And I hope that I can trigger a few of those kinds of thoughts for you this evening. So let's look at three aspects of the supremacist position. First, their shift to the right, the shift to the right, not just theirs. Fear of loss, and thirdly, fear of pluralism. Shift to the right. You remember the time when the far right was the home of the John Birch Society? That was about as far right as you could go. Now people are leaving the John Birch Society because it's not radical enough. It's not right enough. The far right, I suggest, has shifted much farther right and has become much more absolutist as it has shifted. And those absolutist positions, whether that's on the very far left or the very far right, is what leads, I would suggest, to violence and bigotry. The far right has moved the mainstream toward the right as well, I would suggest. And whether you accept my suggestion or not, or whether you consider yourself to be on the right, I hope that you will agree that what I'm suggesting here this evening bears some analysis. For example, the extreme positions of the radical racist far right makes the previous far right somehow seem much more acceptable. See how outlandish they are, after all. We're not so bad, therefore. I wouldn't physically attack someone just because they're of a different race, as those folks would do. So my racist slurs and my housing discrimination isn't all that bad. The Aryan nations call for a white Aryan homeland in the Northwest, and somehow that makes isolationism appear to be a bit more mild and acceptable. Or putting AIDS victims in concentration camps and calling that disease God's revenge on the gay lesbian community is the clear expression of some more subtle homophobia that keeps legislation in Montana and elsewhere from passing that would protect gay men and lesbians from malicious harassment attacks. The obvious racism of Richard Butler's preaching should point out the direction that some other radical fundamentalist theologies can take. Efforts by some preachers, for example, to lead in the re-Christianization of America and to promote America as the promised land. That can all provide God's approval for discrimination against people of other religions or those who have no organized religion at all. Richard Butler and other Christian identity preachers use religion as the basis for their bigotry. The authority for their position for them comes from God. I suggest that others in our society use God as the basis for more subtle bigotry as well. And perhaps when we see that radical theological issue called Christian identity theology, we can more easily identify some of the theological basis for mainstream bigotry too. We are still the most segregated in our society at any time of the week on Sunday mornings. The supremacists are telling us something about ourselves if we listen to them, something that most of us perhaps would prefer to ignore. The shift to the right carries problems with it, and we would just as soon not acknowledge that. The supremacists are extremists. They are manifesting for us what that shift to the right looks like if it's carried to its extreme. If we are amongst those who believe in the right position, the position to the right, then I think we must seriously consider strategies to keep that shift to the right from degenerating into the bigotry of the supremacists. If we do not accept the position toward the right, then I think we need to devise ways to move the mainstream back toward the middle at least. Shift to the right. Fear of loss. The supremacist materials talk about loss. Losing control of their financial situation as individuals, losing control of the financial situation as a nation, even losing control financially in the world. Part of the Jewish conspiracy, they say, even though this takes many different forms, trilateralism, etc., part of the Jewish conspiracy is this breakdown in economic stuff, economic matters. And so their solution is simply to eliminate the Jewish people and the problem will go away. Eliminate the Jewish people and economic problems individually, nationally, and worldwide will be resolved. Since the Jews control the money in the government, Zog, it's okay to refuse to pay taxes. It's the basis for their tax revolt amongst the constitutionalists. The loss of law and order, they would say, is because of blacks who are incapable of being law-abiding citizens. And so they would suggest eliminate the black population and you've taken care of the problem with law and order. The loss of jobs, which causes them great concern, is attributable to Hispanic and Asian immigration. And so all we'd have to do is stop that immigration and we've taken care of unemployment. The loss of moral fiber, they would suggest, is because of the gay and lesbian population and their acting out, which destroys the moral fiber of our society. They're talking all the time about losing control of the economics, losing control of law and order, losing control of jobs, losing control of the moral fiber of our country. And then they add one more basic loss. The supremacists see that they are somehow losing the country, which means it was theirs in the first place. But Christian identity teaches that indeed it was theirs. It is indeed the promised land. And that promised land theology provides the theory and the foundation for this assumption. Changing demographics, women in positions of power, pluralism in religion, all this is very threatening to those who are convinced that unless white Christian males are in charge, the country will fall apart. I suggest this evening that with this message of loss, the supremacists are giving voice to an attitude that lies hidden and silent in our society, but an attitude that nonetheless drives many actions and many policy decisions. The loss of economic control and power. Maybe we don't blame that loss on the Jewish people in polite society. Maybe we aim that much more at people of Japanese descent or the Japanese nationals today. We are looking for someone to blame rather than recognize the fact that we spent ourselves into being a major debtor nation of the world in order to provide weapons of destruction. To acknowledge that fact, but to ignore that and to look for scapegoats is all too often our form of acknowledging that sense of loss. The loss of law and order. 3 black young men on a street corner in urban America today are assumed to be a gang. It's not that same assumption with 3 white Caucasian males on a street corner. In some places, the war on drugs has become a war on people of color. Even though the majority of drugs are used, sold, and the majority of drug money goes through white hands, not hands of color. The crimes of those responsible for the S&L failures who happen to be white and rich will cost the taxpayers much more than the crimes of those in inner cities who happen to be people of color and poor. But we focus our attention on the people of color and poor. We focus the drift toward lawlessness with those people rather than with the white and rich. I suggest we do some of the same kind of projection that the supremacists do. Loss of jobs. We too, all too often, fail to realize that historically immigration has resulted in increased productivity and increased jobs rather than somehow taking away jobs from people who had them. Most immigrants take jobs that resident Americans will not take anyway. Unemployment in the United States is not because of immigration. Rather, it's other problems in our society that we choose to ignore. Excuse me. We're searching for scapegoats here as well to explain what we see as a loss in our society. The loss of moral fiber, blamed on gays and lesbians. We still in our mainstream society give permission, much of that permission with the encouragement of religion, permission to mistreat people because of their sexual orientation. Why do we refuse to look at the fact that one of the leading causes of suicide amongst teenagers is the struggle with sexual orientation? Because somehow we see that as being a loss. Somehow we see sexual orientation, gay sexual orientation, as being a breakdown in the moral fiber. Somehow it is their own responsibility that they're setting into that kind of a life pattern. The supremacists attack gays and lesbians, in some cases physically assaulting them, in other cases calling for their complete internment. Mainstream society, I would suggest, follows a similar path by refusing to pass and enforce laws prohibiting malicious harassment of gay men and lesbians, by sometimes treating AIDS as God's vengeance on the homosexual community for their misconduct, and by often even refusing to acknowledge the presence of gay men and lesbians in our midst. We can intern others in camps. We can also intern them through ignoring their very presence. The loss of country may be something as well that we need to look at in ourselves. 1992, quincentennial year, we look at the arrival of Columbus and the impact of the encounter of the European continent's culture with that of the Native American people here. My time of going through school, I learned a whole different kind of myth about all of that. Columbus was an adventurer and a discoverer and a bringer of all kinds of good things to the Native American population. I didn't learn about the millions of people that were killed in subsequent years. I didn't learn about the total obliteration of some whole tribes of people, some whole nations of people. I wonder if young people today are hearing a different version. I hope so. But as I hear some of the rhetoric around this celebration of Columbus this year, I wonder if we really still have broken through some of those negative and misinformed myths that have surrounded us as the conquerors of this people. When we only hear that European history is the only history of importance, when all history in our educational system revolves around the Christian faith, when invasions and colonizations, even genocide of Native American peoples, has been justified by the assumption that white Christian is superior over all others, when much of this attitude still prevails and maybe finds its way into some modern-day wars as well, how much of the supremacist message strikes some deep familiar chords within us? The loss of country somehow. Efforts to re-Christianize America. Does this mean that America isn't what it's supposed to be unless it is Christian? How far is this from the Christian identity notion of a divine mandate? Males refusing to deal with sexist language. Does that attitude reflect the sense of we will lose something if we give in to this? Reluctance to adjust curriculum to be inclusive of all cultures, both sexes, and all religions. When opposition to this change talks about losing something, is the attitude all that much different from that of the supremacists? I suggest that we reflect seriously, personally and as a society, about the influence that this fear of loss has in our lives and on the decisions that we make, especially in hard economic and challenging economic times. Fear of pluralism, third one. The supremacists speak against the mixing of the races. They want a white homeland, complete separation, a white Aryan homeland in the Northwest. Fear of pluralism has driven them to this extreme position. Society for them must be white and Christian to the core. That's the way God intended it to be, after all, they would say. Everything and everything else and everyone else is second rate and should be in their proper place. And what about the attitudes of the rest of society? Are we always that accepting of and embracing of diversity? White flight to the suburbs or to parts of Montana and Idaho, etc., where white is the obvious majority or the exclusive occupants of an area? English-only laws. What's some of the real reason behind some of those English-only laws? The reason given in many cases is that unless you learn English, you can't economically achieve in our society, and that's probably true. But is that the only reason? Pluralism is okay, it seems, as long as the Caucasian is at the top of the group. But when pluralism starts to mean equality, then often that pluralism is threatening. English-only laws are pushed, re-Christianization of America, fundamentalism finds new advocates, school integration breaks down, Sunday morning still remains the most segregated time of the week, and even some words are changed. In California, where people of color will soon be the majority, the terms minority and majority are no longer used by the people in power positions. Do we really believe that this is a pluralistic country? Or do we somehow have in our back of our minds somehow that attitude with which most of us were raised that says it really is a white Christian country and that others live here somehow as guests? And are we therefore frightened, as some others are frightened, when that guest list grows? Do we see pluralism as an opportunity or a threat? The supremacists definitely see it as a threat. So the shift to the right, fear of loss, the fear in the face of pluralism, the supremacists express these issues loudly and very clearly. But the issue lies right beneath the surface for a significant portion of the rest of our society. That's the silent bigotry. That's the part of the iceberg below the waterline. We will not take care of racism and bigotry in our society by somehow eliminating the supremacists, even if that were possible. Rather, when we address successfully the silent bigotry in mainstream United States, then we will eliminate the fuel that feeds the racist fires of the supremacists in the first place. I think that the voice of the supremacist is irritating to us, yes, because it does express a belief that is harmful to individuals and to society, yes indeed. But I think that that voice of supremacy is irritating to us as well, because it sometimes challenges us to look at some attitudes inside each one of us that we would prefer to ignore and deny. There are many possible explanations for the increase of bigotry in our society these days. For the fact that we have not eliminated bigotry from our own hearts in many cases, much less for society as a whole. We can point to the lack of national leadership on this issue. We can point to the lack of vision of what our society could and should be. We can point to hard economic times, the widening gap between the rich and the poor, the growing insecurity about the national economic situation, the questions about the United States' role in the world as a world economic power. We can point to the changing demographics, the increasing diversity, the fact that we rub elbows and shoulders with those who are different from ourselves more and more frequently. We can point to a number of different things, including the increase in violence and our tendency to resolve problems violently rather than by war as a nation or with guns in school. Whatever the reason, the challenge of making a diverse society work in the United States is facing us all. All of us must be activists on this issue. We must, I think, provide an education for ourselves and our children that will prepare us for living in this very diverse society. We must provide a forum for informed critical thinking that will enable us to challenge the misdirection of prejudice and discrimination, whether that comes from people running for elected office, or whether that comes from the pulpit of Christian identity and other preaching, or whether that comes from those who would revise portions of history, such as the elimination of the Holocaust, or whether that comes from the entertainment and the news media that profits from continuing stereotypes. We must provide a spirit that will make the United States great in the next century, not because somehow we have the clout to bash and oppress others economically or militarily, but a spirit that will provide and make us leaders and make us great in the next century because we have a richness of a diverse population that can provide a model for the world of how peacefully we can all get along with each other. E pluribus unum is the motto of our nation. One vision, one human race, one nation, many peoples, many cultures, many races, many religions, many different religious perspectives. E pluribus unum, unity based on the acceptance of diversity. The supremacists would have us ignore the pluribus of our motto. Our challenge is to assure that the supremacist message finds no resonant chords in us individually or in our society. Our challenge is to not avoid the denying what the racists are telling us about ourselves, to avoid denying the message that they give us about our own bigotries, and to root out that bigotry that still resides in each one of us. I would suggest that that challenge faces us tonight, tomorrow. I would suggest that that challenge is going to be even more of a challenge in the immediate years to come. I would also suggest that the encouraging sign is that many more people in our society, many more people in the Northwest, are turning their attention and turning their hearts and turning their commitment to addressing again the problem of bigotry and racism, to addressing again that vision of how we might live as a diverse society in harmony and peace, in cooperation with each other rather than in conflict with each other. And I would challenge you to take up that challenge that faces us all. Thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you for your attention. We have some time for some questions and some discussion if you'd like.
I would just like to announce that after the question period, there will be a reception for Bill Wasmuth in the hall above the lecture room.
Okay. Anyone have some questions or something you'd like to discuss? Please, sir.
You haven't mentioned religion very much, except for the radical theology and Christian identity movement. My background is Irish Catholic, and Catholic is the biggest denomination in the country. And the LDS Church is a big church in this part of the country and a growing church. I wonder, on a positive or negative side, what church involvement is there in the movement that you're working with? And what do you see in the broad base of everyone in America believing in God kind of notion we hear in all the polls, supporting the problem or supporting the solution? Would you talk to that area?
Sure. That's a whole number of things that you brought up there. I'll go after a couple of them. In terms of involvement of religious groups in the coalition, we have a number of individual churches and we have a number of denominations that have joined the coalition. Some of them are more active than others. It's generally going to be membership in the coalition from rather mainstream sorts of churches. The more fundamentalist churches are generally not as involved in social issues such as the racism issue. The LDS Church, Mormon Church, when we had our conference in Boise this last October, we made a very definite effort to go to the LDS Church and involve them in that conference. And our point in dealing with them, our starting premise was we can't talk about bigotry in Idaho or in this region without dealing with the bigotry in relationship to the Mormon Church. Bigotry both in terms of their being the victims of bigotry and bigotry also in terms of their being the perpetrators of it in some areas of the state where you can't get a job, you can't live unless you are a part of the church. We were doing well there for quite a while, and then all of a sudden the cooperation was withdrawn. And when we asked about that, it wasn't any kind of a conflict with what we were doing. It was simply they were nervous about the fact that we were singling out the Mormon Church, and they thought it should be inclusive of some other churches as well. And by the time we found that out, we didn't have time to negotiate that around, so we didn't have as much involvement with the Mormon Church as we would have liked. I think, personally, that the churches have fallen down in recent years in terms of providing real leadership for justice and equality. Certainly during the civil rights days, churches and church leaders were right at the forefront of the movement. And that was true not just in the South, that was true across the country, and true in a lot of mainstream churches. I think in the last 10 or 15 years, as many other organizations and individuals in our country turned attention away from the civil rights issues, churches did as well. Some of that was survival, some of that was kind of regrouping the forces, some of it was turning away from social justice issues. I happen to believe that if you believe in the gospel, you also have to believe that at the heart of that gospel is social justice. But unfortunately, that's not always true in churches. Not everybody else agrees with my perception of that. Some would say that social justice is sort of the thing you do when you have time and when you have extra resources, but it doesn't always happen. So some churches are involved. In short, to answer your question, I would like to see a whole lot more involvement of the churches in the coalition. I would like to see a whole lot more leadership from churches in terms of addressing the issue of bigotry. They are extremely influential in setting tones and setting attitudes in communities. If the churches cooperated in helping to set a tone against racism in an individual community, a lot of that would be, a lot of the tone is already taken care of, a lot of the direction is already set. Does that sort of cover what you're asking about? Okay. Please, ma'am.
Do you believe that there's any parallel between an increase in bigotry and the fact that we kind of sort of took religion out of schools?
I've never really studied that question. Do you have a thought on that? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, it's being Catholic and then Catholic Jewish. I've always thought that religion needs to be a basis to everyday life.
Yeah.
And by taking it out of schools, I kind of figured they took it away from those that didn't have the opportunity.
I certainly believe that when we're dealing with the issue of racism, we're dealing with a fundamentally moral question. You know, it's down to how do we deal with each other, how do we relate with each other. And no matter what your religion, that's always at the heart of the message somehow. Love your neighbor as yourself, or those kinds of things. Some religions get a little bit selective in terms of who that applies to and who it doesn't, but still how do we treat our neighbor is still at the heart of it all. On the other hand, what you're suggesting seems to imply that those who have received a religious background have nothing to do with bigotry in our society, and I don't think that's true. Certainly if you look at the Catholic population as well, and I'm talking from experience as a Catholic priest, we've been, in the history of the Catholic Church, been some of the worst perpetrators of bigotry all the way from the witch hunts to the Inquisition. So just having a religious background does not automatically mean that one is removed from bigotry. If one really buys into that moral commandment of love your neighbor as yourself, then that should theoretically move us away from bigotry and racism. And it doesn't always do that because we don't always live up to it. Please.
One of the issues in this country for the last few years has been the defense of very right-wing groups by very left-wing groups, the issue of freedom of speech. The most obvious example has been the ACLU's defense of the Nazi Party march in the Jewish neighborhood in Illinois. More recently, the ACLU's attempt to fight to get David Duke on the ballot. I think in Oregon, somewhere where he was...
A number of different states, actually.
And actually, issue on this campus was whether one is doing the right thing by banning certain kinds of racist speech, and whether there should be a code that would do so. And the question is, are groups that seek to allow full exercise of constitutional rights by people who would deny them to others, helping or hurting the racist groups that are being subject?
Good question. Thank you. I stay very close to the ACLU in Seattle, and I do that on purpose. I tell them that, I'm not trying to deny the freedom of speech rights, etc., of the Aryan nations, but on the other hand, one of my goals is I would be the happiest if they all went away. And so if that happens, I want the ACLU to be sure that I'm not doing that by violating any freedoms and any rights that they might have. I think that the freedom of speech in our country is a very, very sacred kind of thing, and I uphold the need for that very, very much. I also think that it's possible in criminal law to maintain freedom of speech and still also curtail legally some threatening versions of speech. I think when freedom of speech is exercised in a threatening way, that's no longer just freedom of speech. I think that's also a violation of the rights of others. If I come up to you and say you're dead tomorrow because your hair is dark and I can't stand dark hair, I don't think that I'm exercising my free speech by doing that. What I'm doing is issuing a threat to you, and I can't hide behind free speech and justifying that threat. So I think that we can make some clear distinctions between free speech, the exercise of free speech, and threatening speech. Now obviously there are going to be some gray areas in the middle there that are not going to be absolutely clear. But in terms of criminal law, that's what judges and court systems are about, and that's what juries are about, is to delineate when that line is crossed and when it's not. In terms of restricting certain patterns of speech in a community such as the university, that politically correct question, I guess, is the one you're asking. I think that we need to carry on a very serious dialogue and a very serious discussion of that, which means I don't have a definite answer for it. I think that it is important to create an environment where people function freely. That's what lawsuits, class action suits in corporations where racist or sexist language and actions take place, and other people who cannot move out of that environment, who have to stay there for their job, say, this sexist language, these racist actions are creating an environment in which I am uncomfortable and which I cannot work. I think the same sort of situation exists on a university campus. If this campus is filled with sexist remarks and sexist actions, the women of this campus do not have equal access to education. And I think that's a violation of their rights, and that something needs to be done about that. If this campus is one that is constantly harassing through verbal taunts those of African American descent, then that is prohibiting them from having equal access to an education, and they can't leave it. It's different from somebody standing on a street corner and exercising their free speech by saying slurring names or racist jokes, because the people can leave that environment. But if it's on a campus or if it's in a workplace where the people can't leave, then I think that needs to be dealt with. So I'm glad that those discussions are happening on university campuses. I think to really seriously work through those discussions is extremely important. Free speech is extremely important, but also an environment that does not intimidate, does not frighten is important. And where those two come together is not going to be an easy solution. Just that being said, one of my concerns is that sometimes we can get so caught up in the politically correct conversation that we sort of spin our wheels there and ignore the fact that much more of an underlying question of racism needs to be dealt with. And so I would hope that we don't somehow get caught up in the politically correct conversation and in the process of that move aside from or ignore or forget the racial attitudes and the racial stuff that's going on still within us. Please.
Yes, sir. I'm a retired professor, and I served for some years as an advisor to Associated Students of the University of Montana. And a question came up of a visit or speech by Duke, David Duke, in Utah. And it turned out that the University Students Association voted $5,000 to pay for David Duke to come up. And as a faculty advisor, who lost some good friends in the Second World War, where the question of racism was decided, it seems to me. You know, it just isn't a matter to be talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I advised them not to pay David Duke to come to this campus to give a racist speech. I said if he wants to come here and get up on the soapbox, okay, but don't give the students money to pay him to come here. And we took a vote of the council, and I didn't vote because I was a faculty advisor. But I lost my constituency, and they voted to pay him to come here.
Mm-hmm.
And then the press was there, and I was accused of all kinds of civil rights violations. But my position, sir, is that the question of race is no longer debatable. It was solved by my dead comrades in the Second World War. We don't, I mean, the human race, and I'm talking as a biologist, there's no one race, second race, other. We're all the same race. Now, my question is, was I right or was I wrong?
Let me check with God on that one. I wish that I could agree with you that the problem of racism was solved with World War II. I mean, that we certainly committed ourselves in a certain direction, saying that we wouldn't tolerate that kind of racism that was being manifested in Germany. Yes, we did. But even at the same time that we were doing that in the United States, we were still experiencing a great deal of racism in terms of the oppression of African American people, etc. So that we made a definite statement in the direction that we thought that the human race ought to go, yes. That we solved the problem with World War II, no, I don't think that quite happened. Paying a supremacist speaker to come on campus, I don't have a good solution to that one. I understand the freedom of speech. I generally believe that it's much better for these voices to be heard out loud rather than to be suppressed. I'm not at all opposed to the fact that David Duke was on the ballots. I think that he would put him into the political arena, get him out there, get him into the political arena so people can really see what he's about. I think that the subversive kind of racism, the behind-the-scenes kind of racism is much worse. I trust the American population enough to know that, to believe that if David Duke and what he really believes in is held up to the light of day, that the population will choose otherwise. Now, so I believe in his freedom of speech, and I believe that he should have the opportunity to say that the student body should have paid him, and that seems to be your point. That I'm not going to enter into. I don't know how that all figures out, how that all shakes out. I don't necessarily agree in giving them money, and I certainly agree with you that this is not an issue in our society to which there are two equally debatable sides. That, to my mind, our country is committed very much in one direction. To my mind, the Constitution stakes our direction. To my mind, we've fought wars over that. And to my mind, there is one direction in terms of equality and justice in this diversity in our society, and that all other things are deviations. They aren't an equally valid opposite point of view. They're deviations. So we don't enter, for example, as a coalition in open debate with the supremacists. We don't because, for one, you can't openly debate them well because they don't base their premises on any kind of reasonable debate laws. Secondly, because it puts things in an equal status. It gives them kind of equal acceptance. That theirs is a debatable position and that somehow whoever debates best wins the issue, and I refuse to see it as that way. Please, ma'am, in the back.
Let me follow up on what you just started into there as strategy. It concerned me, as we heard several years ago, that we had, a particular nation group or hate group going to settle in one town in Montana or another, and immediately part of the reaction of those who felt very strongly against that was, let's organize against that happening. I had reservations about that in terms of you can't debate them. Do you legitimize them by somehow confronting them in public? Strategy-wise, how do Montana communities who either have the Malolo or are faced with them coming in, what do you advise?
I think it's a matter of education. And I think it's a matter of educating in terms of what those supremacist groups really believe and what they're about, so that you get the full message, not just the surface message that they might want to have you hear or see. I think it's also education in terms of who are we as a society and what do we really believe and what do we want. The motto for the coalition, for example, is saying yes to human rights is the best way of saying no to racism. So rather than organizing to directly confront, I would prefer to use terminology, and granted the end result might be somewhat the same, but I would sooner use terminology that says we should organize to promote dignity, promote respect for all peoples, to promote diversity with peacefulness. We should organize to promote that positive aspect of what our society is. In doing that, yes, indeed, we are confronting the opposite, but we're not warring with them in a direct confrontational way in the sense that we can quit as soon as they go away. What we're doing is saying, this is what we believe in, we're going to hold this up. And we're going to be, by holding this up, we're going to show you, the supremacists, how much your ideology is in conflict and in difference from mainstream. We don't have to fight you. All we're going to do is hold up this image, and all we're going to do is hold up what this country is really about. And then you will see how out of touch you are with what the rest of society has to say. That's what I would think the organizing should be. It's on that positive vein rather than in a confrontative kind of vein. Now, not everybody will agree with me. Some will say that wherever supremacists are, particularly wherever they've gathered, there needs to be a confrontational kind of counter-demonstration. Sometimes I would agree with that. As an always basis sort of thing, no, I won't. I don't think that's what dealing with this issue is all about, is simply confronting the racists. Because then again, we fall into that trap that if somehow the racists went away, the problem would be resolved. And that's simply not true. Racism is a deeper issue. Use the presence of supremacists as a basis and as a reason for getting at the below the surface iceberg. Let's become more accepting of each other. Let's become more respectful of each other because supremacists are in our community, rather than somehow letting them turn us into haters ourselves. Please, sir.
Yeah, I have a statement and a question to make in regard to what you said.
Okay.
Now, I happen to be a member of the Church of the Creator, and I know very much what happened in Florida, and I have documentation, proof that act was legitimate, form of self-defense.
Okay.
Now, my question,
We're going to have to let the courts decide that, right?
yeah, and
Okay.
before now, but my question to you is this. Now, you went through, all these people, these able supremacists and all that, but you conveniently ignored the fact that the Jewish religion was based on the Talmud, which is the most fanatic, hateful, racist, and have perpetrated a program of genocide against the white race, and that's what these supremacists are fighting against. But yet you conveniently ignored all that now. How do you justify that?
Well, I can justify it because I don't believe it. I think that you're establishing that the Jewish people are trying to terminate the white race, and I don't think that's true.
Absolutely, right in their Talmud. I have it right in the
Yeah. Well, you're going to have to prove that on your own forum, not at this one. Okay.
There's an aspect of the question that I don't think has been fully addressed, and that is the issue of paranoia in racist thought. The whole problem, the whole question of mental illness associated with this kind of paranoia, these kinds of attitudes. Have there been any studies done on that particular aspect of the problem?
No, I don't know of any. That's not saying there haven't been any done, but I don't know of any. The closest and most analytical thing that I know of is Professor Aho's book, and that's from a sociological perspective, not a psychological perspective. I think, though, that in my experience in dealing with this issue in the recent years, and I'm certainly not a long-term expert on it, that we would fall into a trap if we somehow assumed that all supremacists fit a certain profile. They come from across the board. Some are old, some are young. Some are from poor family backgrounds, some are from rich family backgrounds. Some are uneducated, some are very educated. Some are mentally, seemingly very unbalanced. Some are apparently very mentally balanced. And so I think we run into a real problem when we attempt somehow to profile and fit them into a certain peg, into a certain hole. It simply, does not seem to be an accurate reflection. The supremacist ideology can infect and can work its way into a lot of different aspects of our society. Other questions? Please, ma'am.
Could you comment a little more on how they view women, either, or where they view that white women fit into the society, and if they view minority women as much of a threat as minority men?
The ultimate position in the Aryan nation philosophy for women is that they stand by their warrior men and that they bear white children. The supremacy movement is generally extremely sexist. There are several cases of women leading different groups. Shannon LaRue leads the Southern Justice Skinheads out of Vancouver, for example. Elizabeth Bolus is involved in the American Front out of Colville. So there are some cases where women have leadership roles, but generally it's a very male-oriented group. And generally they would advocate a return to the status of the man being the dominant person. I have a quote in here somewhere I was just glancing at this morning where a guy says something like, if men can vote, why must women need to? Because men can vote for their wives. That sort of thing, to express their opinions. Now, he has something of an idealized version of the agreement between husband and wives that I've never noticed, but that sort of posture. God's Country is a play that was written several years ago about the activities of the order. And the writer there did a very interesting thing. He held historically accurate on most of the stuff in relation to the men, but he couldn't find anything in relation to the women, to the wives of these order people, etc. And so he allowed some playwright liberties to take place, and he wrote monologues into the play for women. And those monologues are extremely painful, gut-wrenching kinds of things, of the struggle that these women were going through in terms of trying to be loyal to their men partners and trying to reconcile this kind of hatred with their natural instinct of motherhood and love of life and those kinds of things, that they were trying to struggle with in terms of their background as women. I liked what he did, even though I don't know how accurate it is in terms of what some of the women in supremacist movements are really going about. A Current Affair, that national TV show, they're currently filming something on women in the supremacist movement. I don't know when it's going to be shown, but they're currently working on it. I just talked to one of the producers about it the other day. So there might be a little bit more insight there. Ms. Magazine had an excellent article about a year and a half ago that they did some research on women in the supremacist movement as well. Helpful? Okay. Other questions? Good. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much all for coming, and you're all invited to enjoy the cookies in the background. I can assure you my wife's cookies are not poisonous, so you'll enjoy them.
And if any of you want any of this material up here or want to look at the rest of it, feel free to come forward.